So now that we've talked about xylem, our next question is, how does food, or how do food and nutrients move throughout the plant? We know that xylem transports water. It also transports dissolved minerals and hormones, but how does sugar get around? So phloem is the transport mechanism for transporting sugar. And phloem is made of living cells, live cells. Remember xylem, it was made of dead cells? The phloem's made of living cells. They transport food, oxygen, and hormones. Main thing here is that they transport the food or the sugar. You can see here we have a picture, xylem and phloem. If you take a class on plants in college, or if you take AP biology, you'll learn some different parts of the xylem and phloem. We're not going to talk about all the different parts. We're just going to talk about them generally now. So we said that xylem can only transport water up. Phloem can transport in both directions. So that's what we're going to write. And this is going to become really important because the sugar is mostly made in the leaf. And so it's got to be able to get to the other parts of the plant because that's the food for the plant that makes energy. The other thing we have to think about is during the winter time. So in the winter time, the leaves fall off of a lot of trees and a lot of plants. And so what happens is they move all of the sugar to the stem and the roots. And then in the summer, they move that sugar back towards the buds or the leaves that are going to be forming. So sugar has to be able to be transported in both directions. So if we take a look at this picture, where is sugar made in a plant? I just told you. It is made in the leaves. And then my next question for you, what part of the plant doesn't have a lot of sugar? This would be the roots, or you could also say the stem, but the stem is also greenish, so it does have some chlorophyll in it. So when we're moving sugar, we always move it to an area, from an area with lots of sugar, and we call that area the source, to a sink, which is an area with a little bit of sugar, or not a lot of sugar. In this case, it's going to be the roots. So this is typically the way that it goes. It goes from leaves to roots, but in the springtime, remember, all the sugar's been stored in the roots because the leaves fell off. And so in that case, since the roots and the stems have a lot of sugar, they would be the source, and the sink would be the buds, okay? So the source is not always the leaves, and the sink's not always the roots, but for our purpose right now, we'll go ahead and write leaves and roots. You might be thinking, Ms. Mason, I see this crazy diagram on the right and I have no idea what's going on. Yep, don't worry, we're going to talk about it. It's all about how this sugar moves. So how does it move from the leaves to the roots? So first, I need you to write down that sugar always moves from source to sink. Think about when we talked about diffusion and osmosis, from a high concentration to a low concentration. That's kind of what our sugar is doing, from where there's a lot to where there's a little. So now we're going to talk about how this all happens, okay? So we take a look at our diagram here. We have this thing that we're going to write in a second, but let's take a look at this diagram. So here's what happens. We're making lots and lots of sugar in our leaf, okay? It's going to actually end up going into the phloem. So this is our cell that's doing photosynthesis, okay? Making lots of sugar. That sugar is going to move into the phloem. Now, once it moves into the phloem, what happens is water from the xylem actually goes in there as well. And this increases the pressure inside of this cell. We call this turgor pressure. You'll learn more about this if you take another class on plants. But our water moves in and it increases the pressure. Think about, we have a lot of stuff in this cell now. We got water and sugar and it's pushing on the walls. Okay? And then what happens is because there's so much pressure, it wants to relieve that pressure, and so it starts traveling downwards. Okay? And so our water and our sugar ends up traveling downwards until it gets to the roots or where it needs to go. All right, it's dropped off, and then our water ends up leaving, okay, and goes back to the xylem. So the water really is helping to carry this sugar down the phloem, okay? Think about our blood vessels, right? We talked about, you may have remembered, we talked kind of about how plasma is the liquid that carries our blood cells. In this case, water is the liquid that helps carry the sugar to where it needs to go. We have another diagram here. It's showing the same thing, okay? We have a leaf here. We've got sugar entering, and once sugar enters, water's gonna enter, all right? And this is a high pressure, so we don't want it to remain high pressure. And so it starts flowing downwards, okay? And it flows to where there's less pressure. And usually that's at the root and the stem. And then once it gets to wherever it's going to get, the sugars leave, and then they're going to be used for energy. That pressure that I talked about, that turgor pressure, you may have remembered from 7th grade or talking about cell parts that plants have a vacuole. So do animal cells. It's just where they store a lot of stuff, and a lot of that stuff is water. And so with the vacuole gets filled up when there's lots of water there, and that makes the plant, helps the plant stand upright, because that pressure holds the plant upright. When we don't have enough water, that vacuole shrinks, and that cell can't stand upright, and it starts wilting. So this is another reason why we need water, is it helps maintain that pressure. So my question is, where is all the sugar during the winter when the plant has no leaves? It is in the roots, also some of it in the stem and the trunk. Okay? And our problem here is that buds need sugar. So in the spring, all of our sugar is in the stem and the roots, but the buds need sugar, and they're up by the tips of those branches. So what happens then is in the spring, the sugar is all in the roots here. So this would be reversed. We'd have a lot of dots of sugar down here, and it's going to use the same process. Water is going to come in, help it flow upward, and it's going to move to the buds. And then that sugar is used to create energy. Sometimes you'll hear this process of moving sugar called translocation, okay? It just means moving sugar. So if you hear that word, just know it means moving the sugar throughout the plant. So now we're going to look at a stem, because we were talking about how stuff moves in stems. We looked at a root before, so now we're going to look at a stem and see where are these xylem and phloem tubes that are helping things move. So you can either do a sketch of this in your notebook. I have a cutout that I handed out to students, but if you're at home, you can just do a sketch because this is pretty simple. So this is our stem, okay? And I want you to label the different parts here. So remember, our root has an epidermis, just like our leaf, and our stem now. That's the outermost layer. Then we have something called the cortex. We'll talk about what that does a little later. And then our xylem and phloem are these black dots, and we call them vascular bundles, and that's the same term that we can use in a leaf or in a root. The xylem and phloem together are called vascular bundle. Remember, vascular tissue is the tissue that causes or that moves things, that transports things. Now, we've been talking about a maple tree and how it makes maple syrup. So if we take a look at a tree trunk cross-section, it's a little bit different. You don't need to know the tree trunk cross-section for the test. I'm just showing you how it looks a little different. But you'll see that the xylem and phloem are kind of more like rings, and then the rings here in the middle, those are our tree rings. So they still have xylem and phloem in a tree. It's just not as pronounced as here. Now, while we've been talking about maple syrup, I thought I would show you a little picture. So maple syrup tapping, when we're tapping that tree, it's going in and we're trying to get to the xylem and phloem. And so there's a certain depth that we have to tap into a tree, usually 1.5 to 2 inches, and that's where that tap goes in. So besides sugar and water, what else do plants transport? I know we talked about some other things, but I'm just reiterating here. If we take a look, right, xylem and phloem, they can transport hormones, minerals. These are some examples of hormones, okay? Some hormones help seeds germinate. Some help plants grow, help them flower, develop fruit, make seeds go dormant. So that's when we talk about hormones, that's what hormones in plants do. And then minerals, these are things that you see in fertilizer, okay? No need to write down these minerals. This is just kind of extra information. But when I say, oh, plants transport minerals, they're things that plants need for growth. And those are things that you would find in fertilizer. So there we have it. Phloem transports the food and sugar. Xylem transports the water.